Geoffrey says, the clock whizzes round at an accelerated pace, and before you turn round, 3/4 of an hour have gone, and a sinking feeling in your... you begin to think, how am I to get this across? And it's quite impossible. It is, I have to confess, one of the most frustrating things that I know. 3/4 of an hour, an hour and a quarter even, seems to flash past. And at the end of it, I haven't said a 10th part of what I had intended to say at the outset. And probably not less than 100th part of what I actually wanted to say has actually got across at all. Oh, such is life. This particular section, section 9, the 3 schemes of evolution, and possibly we might get on to at the beginning of section 10, because there's some relevant information there, now takes us one step forward in this journey of discovery rather than in a time sequence journey, trying to understand something of the origins and hence the constitution of man, the nature of man. Our story so far, as we had taken it yesterday, had got as far as describing the arrival of the human kingdom in this arena, the globe, the planet. Now we have to try and follow, in some rather more detail, the subsequent growth and development of this nascent human being, man to be, and see what is involved in that growth process. At the outset of this process, covering the first 3 paragraphs in section 9 relatively quickly, at the outset of this, when we say, as it says there, that man arrives on globe A in the first round, what is meant? Well, as we have indicated before, it is not the thinking entity, and certainly not the physical entity, which we normally refer to when we talk of man, but the divine monad. And she makes this very clear in the passage that I've quoted you on page 98 in the same paragraph, 9.1, quoting in this instance a Kabbalistic aphorism, proverb, which recapitulates the cyclic journey of man. Man becomes a stone, a plant, an animal, a man, a spirit, and finally God. That should please Geoffrey. Thus accomplishing his cycle or circuit and returning to the point from which he had started as the heavenly man. But by man, this is the important sentence here, but by man, the divine monad is meant, and not the thinking entity, much less his physical body. So at the root and heart and core of whatever it is that we're looking at, we have to bear in mind that we are looking at this, the heavenly man, the spiritual entity, the divine monad, whatever that might be. Well, at the outset of the journey, it's not very much. It contains a lot in the way of potential as the inheritance of its cyclic journey up to this point. Remember, we discussed right back in section 2 this whole gradual focusing of this monadic essence or life wave into what ultimately are destined to become units of consciousness. And even at this stage, that process is still far from complete. At this outset, as it indicates in section 9.2, whatever this divine monad is, and this is in a sense why it's called the heavenly man, it contains within it the potential of the development of all the 7 principles that we talk of when we talk of the sevenfold man. In the image that we saw in the stanzas this morning with joy, the 7-leaved man plant, well, the monad is the heart of the man plant, but it has within it the capacity to develop 7 leaves, to develop 7 facets of itself, and those modes of function and consciousness are what will ultimately be made manifest as the principles in our constitution, the underlying essences. But the point is that it has them all right at the outset. Sinnett, in trying to understand this, initially imagined that it might be that at the end of each round the monad sort of dipped itself in the sea of conscious life and acquired another principle from somewhere. But he said, well, perhaps it's not that way. Maybe it brings these principles with it at the very dawn. And the Mahatma agrees with this. And the passage that I've quoted you in 9.2 on page 98 shows this. Thus, you see, his fifth principle is evolved from within himself. This is the important bit. Man having, as you well say, the potentiality of all the seven principles as a germ, from the very instant he appears in the first world of causes as a shadowy breath. Don't you just take to these phrases like a shadowy breath? You imagine the monad arriving as a shadowy breath. Gives you a lovely feel of its insubstantial nature. So here we are at the outset of this journey, the monad, a shadowy breath, a unit of being, potential consciousness, as about to undergo this whole cyclic journey. And what is the cyclic journey to accomplish? Well, as again Joy referred to this morning, it can be depicted as the lighting of the 49 fires, the unfolding and developing of the seven aspects of each of the seven principles. Each principle reflects macrocosm to microcosm, inner to outer, the seven principles of the whole. Therefore, there are seven aspects, seven flowers to each of these principles. And as we undergo this sevenfold journey, the seven rounds, the seven globes, however we wish to depict it, the process is to bring into full function the faculties and the consciousness of each of these aspects of our constitution. This is the overall process. This is the big picture, we might say. And the broad rule, as we've indicated previously, is that it takes man the full period of 7 planetary rounds to accomplish this, and therefore, broadly speaking, in each of those rounds he will concentrate on the development of one of those principles. Of course, nothing that he has done previously in early rounds can be lost, so in a sense it can be seen as a cumulative process. In the 4th round, as we've said before, he is developing his 4th principle, but that is within the context of already having developed the first 3. And in their turn, the first 3 are modified by the evolution of the 4th. In the 5th round, we shall concentrate on the evolution of our 5th principle, but that will be in the context of already having perfected the first 4, the lower 4 principles. And so it goes. This is the broad picture that is outlined for us. But in 9.4, section 9.4, we come to the fascinating picture that Joy mentioned this morning, and which we'll now spend some while looking at, which is the factors involved in how this grand task is accomplished. We have to remember and bear in mind something that we have already talked about, and that is, to me, central to an understanding of this. You have to bear in mind the vital distinction between principle and vehicle, between the life and the form, between the inner essence and the outer expression of any of these aspects of our nature. If man brings with him the 7 principles as a germ, he has the essences, the life, the qualities already there. And the process of unfolding these means the developing of the modes of expression of those qualities or essences. We can never draw hard and fast lines, and our little razor blades of intellect try and slice things up into neat, bite-sized pieces. But of course it's never really quite like that, and one can never wholly separate principle from vehicle. But to an extent you have to try and bear in mind these 2 aspects as we go through. And that, I think, will be very important for understanding what immediately follows. I don't want to entirely resurrect that discussion, but just to remind you that we have already last week talked about that. Now, when it comes to the development of the sevenfold nature of man, Adam Blavatsky describes this, and for this purpose I'd ask you to look at the way in which it's phrased on page 100 in the book, as a triple evolutionary scheme. She starts out with one of her famous phrases, "It now becomes plain that." You didn't really need this. She feels that she's told you this already. It now becomes plain that. It now becomes plain that there exists in nature a triple evolutionary scheme for the formation of the three periodical upadis, vehicles, or rather three separate schemes of evolution, which in our system are inextricably interwoven and interblended at every point. These are the monadic or spiritual, the intellectual, and the physical evolution. You can, if you wish, refer back to page 153 in volume 1 of The Secret Doctrine, the diagram that Joy directed us to this morning, because it does reflect, I believe, exactly the same process, and this may help to give you some sort of framework to hang this discussion on. Now you'll see on that diagram, interestingly enough, that she has divided it up in terms of upadis, vehicles, so that in the first pair, 1 and 2, under where it says human principles, spirit and soul, vehicle of spirit, and then 3 and 4, mind and animal soul, upadi of mind, vehicle of mind, life and astral body, upadi of life. And then finally the last one at the bottom, upadi of all the principles, the physical body. In some of her presentations she disregards the physical body as of no importance. Well, I have a few more words to say about that later on, but the principle that is present in this diagram is that we have three broad processes. Again, spiritual or monadic, the first two, 1 and 2. The intellectual, mind and its vehicle, the animal soul or personality, which is the second. Life and the vehicle of life, the astral body, the third, which is what she's here called the physical. You might like to bear that set of distinctions in mind. And although she stresses they are inextricably interwoven and interblended at every point, if they were not separate in some sense, presumably she would have had no need to say that in the first, as she does. If it were not that they were in some sense separate, one would never have bothered to say that they were inextricably interwoven. There has been some weaving taking place of one within another. They have been, I can't think of a good word here, welded, fused together in some way, which implies that in another sense they were and are separate. Which is why she has, I suspect, bothered to stress the three separate streams here, and I'd like to try and get some of this across. Now, she goes on, looking back at page 100. These three are the finite aspects or the reflections on the field of cosmic illusion of Atma, the seventh, the one reality. And then she enumerates what these three schemes are. And although she doesn't tell us very much about them here, there are some very interesting clues. Just for a moment, skip, if you will, the numbered points 1, 2, and 3, and look at the paragraph at the bottom of this section, where it says each of these three systems has its own laws and is ruled and guided by different sets of the highest dhyānis or logoi. Each is represented in the constitution of man, the microcosm of the great macrocosm. And it is the union of these three streams, notice that word, the union of these three streams in him, which makes him the complex being he now is. Again, the union of something implies that they were at one point separate, and that they have met like three streams, the confluence of three streams within him, and that has made him what he now is. Now, I don't want to be divisive and separative here. We've been so at pains to stress our unity, have we not? Wouldn't like to disturb the unity here, but there is a good sense in which these three streams can be separated and studied separately and understood separately. And I think it's profitable so to do within limits. So going back to the points in the numbered points on page 100, she talks of the monadic. It is, as its name implies, concerned with the growth and development into still higher phases of activity of the monad. Well, we're going to say what little there is to say about that in chapter 12 in this book. And I stress there is very little to say, and that comes back to something that Geoffrey neatly avoided saying too much about this afternoon, which was this business about the peregrination of the monad and so forth. It's not profitable to speculate on these sorts of matters. These are so far, it seems to me, beyond our scope and range of understanding in consciousness that to speculate much on this doesn't get us very far. However, with number 2 and number 3, we are intimately concerned, and just about anything that we can learn about this has a direct bearing on the beings we now feel ourselves to be. So, the first stream, in conjunction with the intellectual, who are, I interpolate, represented by the manasa dhyanis, manasa of the quality of mind, manas, dhyanis of mind. There are a whole stack of names by which these entities are known, and I have tried to give you an incomplete list in the book. We'll come to that later as well. Solar Devas, Agnishvata Pitris, and 100 other names besides. The givers of intelligence and consciousness. Notice that, givers of not only intelligence but consciousness. Well, consciousness, yes, but of a particular quality. You have to remember at all times what we've been saying is that everything is conscious anyway. It wasn't that sort of consciousness that they gave us, because we couldn't have been totally without consciousness. Perhaps self-consciousness, if we'd put the self-conscious in there, it might give us a better clue as to what's involved here. And 3, the physical, represented by the chayas. Chaya, literally shadows, of the lunar pitris, another set of dhyanis, as we shall see, round which model nature has concreted the physical body. This body serves as the vehicle for the growth, to use a misleading word, and the transformation through manas, and, owing to the accumulation of experience, of the finite into the infinite, of the transient into the eternal and absolute. Something of a rhetorical flourish, I think, she has got there at the end. I don't think we shall quite become the eternal and absolute, but relatively speaking, perhaps, if one can have a relatively absolute. Now, we are going to be looking at the intellectual and physical stream in some detail in sections chapters 10 and 11 in this book, and over the next several days I shall be spending most of the remaining time I have looking at the processes involved of the construction of the physical vehicles, or the mode in which those are manufactured, and indeed into the intellectual. But before we get there, I would like to say something preliminary about this, to try and give you some sort of clues as to what's involved here. Now, I don't know how much of this is going to be meaningful to you. I hope it is, but let's give it a whirl and see. There is a picture of man as painted in theosophical literature, wherein the various parts of his constitution, the various states of consciousness that he is capable of experiencing, are likened to a model of a lighthouse, with the lighthouse keeper in somehow representing the conscious experiencing self, and walking up the inside of his lighthouse and looking out different windows and so forth, and each level within the lighthouse representing a different state of consciousness, a different order of being, and representing the various different states of experience that we have. Now, fine, I have no objection to that as an introductory model to try and explain something of the nature of the sevenfold man. But every model has its limitation, and that one, to my mind, has a fatal flaw. The fatal flaw is that it's not quite like that. In terms of consciousness, consciousness is not finally, for us, or even ultimately, continuous. Consciousness wells up in a particular vehicle at a particular time. Let me illustrate what I mean. During waking life, we are aware, but it's absolutely vital for that awareness that we have and utilize this physical body. Rather than thinking of the physical body as containing a sort of disembodied consciousness somewhere floating around inside it, a much more profitable way, I suggest, of viewing this is that it is directly as a result of this physical body that we experience physical consciousness, waking consciousness, through the five senses and the brain at all. It's not that there is something else in here which happens to be focused in a physical body and therefore experiences a waking state. It is just because the physical body is so constituted that we assemble a physical state of consciousness, and the resultant of that is the experience of a physical, brain-based I. Now, there's a lot which goes into this. It's not by any means as simple as that, but the I which we feel ourselves to be, looking out of our eyes and hearing with our ears and so forth, is a direct result of the physical body. One of the passages which Geoffrey was alluding to in the Mahatma letters says very suggestively, to my way of thinking, at the moment of death, every person, whether good, bad, or indifferent, whether they die mentally sane or not, whatever the condition of death, loses consciousness. Why? Because at that moment, the physical body ceases to function and can no longer support that consciousness. And there isn't anything else. At that instant, there isn't anything else. Now, what you are, fundamentally, is of course much deeper than that, and after a while a new form can be crystallized, aggregated, however you want to view this thing, and then consciousness will reassert itself. At the point of a new circle, in the middle of a new center, another consciousness will well up, and it will depend very much on how that material is organized as to what state of consciousness that will be. But it is not I who step out of a physical body into another body, into another body. That is, to me, fundamentally to misconceive the process. Is it just me, or is it getting hot in here? It's all this hot air, you see. Now, if I may, if you forgive me for elaborating this a little bit further, I see this as being absolutely fundamental to an understanding of these three schemes of evolution that we're referring to here. We will see over the next few days that the broad pattern of evolution for man is that first we have to develop, the human kingdom, has to develop a physical basis through which consciousness can be expressed at all. And in the first 3 rounds, broadly, with which we are not therefore greatly concerned, we are concerned with the establishment of a physical mode of expression, a physical form, which will sustain a fairly complex consciousness. And this takes a long time, it seems, to develop. What we have done so far is recapitulated, we are told, in the early races on this globe. So our early history on this globe is to recapitulate that process. And by the middle of the 3rd race, we have done that process of recapitulation. And in the words of the stanzas, a rather magical phrase, their joint efforts had produced a good Rupa which could walk, run, recline, and fly. Isn't that lovely? But the point is that it had now resulted in, there's a physical stream, you may say, quite literally a stream, which is producing, quite independently of anything psychological or spiritual, a basis on which we can build. And that is the first stream. Now, as it says at the bottom of this page, each of these 3 systems has its own laws and is ruled and guided by different sets of the highest dhyanis. What is going on here is not fundamentally different from what I believe is going on in the animal kingdom. An animal form is not really that different from a physical human form. Ours is that much more specialized, perhaps, but it's not the physical form wherein the differences between us and the animals lie. Plainly so. In fact, as we've seen earlier, there is a principle whereby we borrow from what the lower kingdoms have already done, and just as the plant borrows from and utilizes the mineral kingdom, and the animal borrows from and utilizes the plant to develop its cell structures and the more complex, so I strongly believe we have done exactly the same. We have borrowed from the animal kingdom and have developed another variety, shall we say, of animal form, which is what this physical body ultimately is. It is a finer form in every respect because of what else is going on, of these 2 other schemes with which we are interblended and interconnected at every point. There is more to it, but at its own level, it is fundamentally that. The broad picture that we're going to see is that at this crucial point, the establishment of this physical basis, within this, then the second scheme, the intellectual scheme, as she calls it, can now begin its development. Just as the physical scheme doesn't just happen of its own accord, but is under the influence and control of these dhyanis or intelligences or hierarchies of creative powers, however you wish to view it, matter does not just spontaneously aggregate itself into animal, never mind human forms. It does so on the basis of a pattern, a model, an intelligence, not a conscious intelligence which is directing it, but the process is intelligent in itself. Intelligence is innate in the whole, and therefore the models and plans on which the physical scheme, whether it's of our kingdom or any other, are based, is innate in it. It doesn't have to be directed in any conscious way. You haven't got dhyanis saying, wouldn't it be nice if we had a being with a head and 2 arms? I don't believe that it's anything remotely resembling that. Their intelligence is not in that sense a directed intelligence, but they are embodied intelligence. They embody the ideas and plans and within the cosmic mind, and these are further then embodied within the material substance of our world, and well up, you might say, as this whole physical stream, culminating in animal man as we now see him. It's interesting that even physical man, is a paradigm of the whole. Even his physical body reflects within it the characteristics of the heavenly man. The passage that HBB has quoted and Yancey has quoted about, from Carlyle, is it? About laying hands on...
Yes, the temple of God.
Yes, yes. Quite literally so, for a number of reasons, not only because of what might, in a sense, be said to dwell in it, but because of the way it has been fabricated as well, not to be in any sense ignored or bypassed. Within the matrix of this physical process, not just thinking now of any one body, I'm not really looking at it within the span of one life, but within the whole broad sweep of the development of the physical form. Within this, another process begins to develop, and that is the development of the intellectual. Now, just as the physical is never going to take off of its own accord, and just as physical forms are not just going to appear out of a vacuum, no more is the psychological and intellectual development of man going to appear out of nothing. In chapter 11 we will look at the specifics of this, and who and how and where and when mind dawned. But there is a broader picture which you should perhaps see, if you can, as the foundation on which this rests. There is a broad pattern of intellectual life in which we are involved. And without getting down to the specifics of individual beings and hierarchies and so forth, just as we require a physical body to express certain modes of our being, so we require an intellectual environment in which to express the capacities of our intermediate principles, fourth and fifth primarily. It's not a body, and this is where I believe that the later theosophists made a fundamental blunder when they started talking about mental bodies. We never do have a mental body. There's no reference made to it in any of the original literature. There is no such form, and it's a mistake to think of it in those terms. There is a mental environment in which we operate, and this mental environment has a substance which is rich in thought and feeling and sensation and perception and so forth. And it is this which we use, this is the very stuff of which we fabricate what we call our personalities and so forth. And it is that broad environment which these sets of the highest dhyānis provide. They don't provide us with little minds and go dropping minds into preformed bodies. They are providing a field, you might say, a field of intelligence in which the seed can grow. There is no point, I believe, in the scheme of things in which individual men wake up to a sense of self-consciousness. They don't suddenly say, here I am. It's, as everything else in nature, it is a process of slow growth. And within this field of intelligence and that the dhyānis have provided, so grows what will ultimately become our psychological, psychic, intellectual nature. But it is up to us to do it. We have to do the work. We have to develop ourselves into individual, self-conscious thinking, feeling entities. They have provided the material, but it now has to be fashioned into something useful and usable. Now, the field that they provide is a very, I believe, very high-order field indeed. I'm speaking still in very general terms, and I will put this perhaps rather differently in a couple of days' time when I get round to talking about it. But trying to look at it this way first, what they have done is to have provided a high-order field or environment in which something is growing, maturing over a long periods of time, the cycles of incarnation and so forth. But what, you might say, is it that is the focus of this whole process? What is it that makes it different one from another? Trying to work out, from any point of view, whether it's theosophical or any other, just what man is the most tantalizing and frustrating process that you might go through. It's rather like trying to nail jelly to the ceiling. Every time that you think that you've come across it, it's slipped through your fingers again. It's rather like trying to catch fish with your bare hands. They wriggle and slip through your fingers just as soon as you think you've caught something of it. And our tendency, it seems to me, in trying to understand these processes is to at once make too much and too little of what we do know of ourselves. We extrapolate from what we do know about ourselves and try and impose those sorts of structures on the other aspects of our being. And that is a terrible mistake. And on the other hand, we make too little of what we are in terms of physical form and physical body, and are inclined to dismiss that. Let me just elaborate that thought for a moment. Taking the latter thought first, we make too little of what we are right now. Within the ambit of what we do know is focused everything. If man is the macrocosm of the microcosm, then everything is fundamentally present in terms of influence, quality, and so forth within the matrix of our ordinary waking consciousness. It is the most marvelous illustration, should we say, living illustration of this whole process. I remember it struck me at one juncture, a thought I might share with you, that you will never be other than what you are right now. We all are inclined to think that we have a vast future to encompass and that we will grow into something else and we'll long to be what we're not. But you will always be what you actually are. Whatever that might be, whether it's something grand or whether it's something trivial, you'll always be just exactly that. And the sooner we get used to the idea that actually where we are, what we know, and how we experience things right now is very, very important, the less we will hanker after other states which we can't possibly know. You can only be where you are. You can, what is it they say, you can't cross the river you haven't come to yet, and you can't cross the river that you've already crossed. You can only go over the one that's immediately in front of you. This, what we see right now, this consciousness, to study this and what we see right in front of us in terms of the information that we're given, produces fascinating insights. Within the limitations of this psychophysical vehicle that we now have, are focused all these principles that we talk of. But it does have a limit. The model that I mentioned earlier of the lighthouse, I believe, is fundamentally mistaken because it doesn't go... you can't take it further. You cannot transfer this consciousness into something else. This consciousness is a product of this particular psychophysical vehicle. And the consciousness that I now feel and will feel during my waking existence for the rest of my life is bounded by the matrix of this psychophysical body that I have built in this particular incarnation. Within its limits, there are a number of states of consciousness that I might experience, whether waking consciousness or dreaming consciousness, sleep consciousness, whether in drug-induced altered states of consciousness, whether in meditation or whatever. They are all within the limits of this psychophysical vehicle. It's enormous in its potentials, and I don't believe for a single instant that we have yet explored the limits of it. But it was all of a kind It is all of a similar character. Although your dreams are very different from your waking existence, they're still based on exactly the same perceptual material. In dreams, you see and you hear and you feel and you smell and you taste, and you're still fundamentally the same person. And in daydreams and in nightmares, you're still fundamentally the same person. Do you see what I'm getting at? You're not suddenly, within the matrix of this psychophysical organism, suddenly going to escape into being a beautiful spiritual being. It's not that I am suddenly going to be transformed into something else, and if I sit here in meditation long enough and concentrate hard enough, then suddenly this, without a break, is suddenly become a Buddha or whatever else. I think that is fundamentally to misconceive the nature of it. And this is why I am distinctly uneasy with the meditational technique which starts off by saying, I am not my body, I am not my emotions, I am not my mind. There is a sense, no doubt, in which this is a valuable exercise to try, but to look at it from a philosophical or metaphysical point of view is to fundamentally misconceive the situation. If you say you are not your body, you are not your mind, just what's left? Just what's left? If I were to actually deprive you of your body, you'd be dead. And as we know, at the moment of death, you're going to lose consciousness anyway. It is, in fact, the very elements of your emotions and your mind which make you the consciousness that you feel yourself to be right now. And without those elements, without exactly those elements of memory and expectations, of longing and desire, of sensation and perception and so forth, you wouldn't be at all. And you couldn't say, oh, well, I'd just be the monad, wouldn't I? This is the greatest and gravest mistake. The monad is of such an different order of being that if all vehicles through which that monad expressed itself were to instantaneously be dissolved, there would be nothing left. No consciousness would remain, no individuality would remain. There would be no vehicle through which those intrinsic and ultimately universal qualities could be expressed. The whole purpose of the thing is to develop these vehicles so that those universal principles can be focused and expressed in material modes, such as we are experiencing right now. This is not to say that this psychophysical organism with which we are intimately connected is the only valid mode that we might experience. And here we would probably part company with the orthodox Buddhists, certainly the southern schools of the Theravada, who would say that there was nothing more to man than this psychophysical complex with which we are intimately connected. This, I guess, is where the theosophical view begins to differ. Yes, we would say there is something else. What we wouldn't say is that it is ultimately permanent or final or in any sense ultimate. And this is where we will come to when we look at this intellectual stream, and we see that underlying this psychophysical organism, this personal man, the incarnated man, there is another order of expression of the man. It is what we loosely and very misleadingly call the ego. And this is where I think, again, many misconceptions have arisen. The so-called ego, which, when we talk about the individuality of man, we say, yes, the reincarnating ego, as if there is some sort of permanent something or other in there somewhere or another, which is the real man. And, this is, when we get there, this will be it. Well, as we shall see when we look at section 11 in the book, this ego isn't ours anyway. It's amongst parts, the bits and pieces that we've borrowed from elsewhere in order to accomplish our journey of developing the sevenfold man. And just as much as the body is borrowed from the physical surrounding, and the life principle is borrowed, and the karma energies are borrowed, and so for all these other bits which we have fabricated into this psychophysical being that we call the personal man, so the elements of the inner man what we call the reincarnating ego, I'm sorry to have to tell you, that's borrowed as well. And at the end of the cycle, that's going to have to be given back as well. And this is where, as I say, it's rather like nailing jelly to the ceiling, and you try and work out just what man is, because every time that you think you've understood, now at last we've come to the real root of the man, you find it has again trickled through your fingers, and that's not yours either. It is a vital component, and much hinges on it, and we will perhaps touch more on this at the end of section 11, where I have given some hints from the literature concerning this so-called ego and its nature. But it is of a very, very different order of being, from the psychophysical consciousness that we currently feel ourselves to be. And to imagine in this lighthouse analogy that the personal man will just suddenly wake up one day and find himself that he's now become the ego or the inner man, or whatever you care to think about it, is again totally misconceived. This inner ego, if that's what we're to call it, is of a different order of existence from us. There is a dividing line between the two, and to imagine that we can escape from one to become the other, I think is far too simplistic. And even beyond this, even when the necessity for this psychophysical mechanism is past, and this succession of personal beings and their personal consciousnesses is finally over, and this higher order within our being asserts itself, wakes up, one might say, in its own right, and starts to function at its own level, we have but seen a higher reflection of the same process. Just as the personal being, the psychophysical being born of one life, is temporary within that life, so we are taught this ego, which although it may persist for a much larger span of life, is too a temporary expression of the indwelling monad, and no more than the personal ego is it permanent. All of these are means or vehicles through which are expressed the essence of the monadic essence, the indwelling life wave. All are vehicles, all are modes of expression. And yet, as I said at the beginning of what I had to say yesterday afternoon, this is not to say that at the end of the process the monad just sort of says, well, thank you very much and good night, and waltzes off into whatever state that it might find itself in. It has been modified by the experience that it has undergone. It wasn't, from the point of view of the monad, whatever that might be, a self-directed effort. The monad didn't say, now I will evolve a series of personalities or an ego or whatever. It was as if around a focus that this process developed. But whatever it is, it has now been modified. As it said in that passage that we looked at once before, right at the end on page 144 if you want to follow it. And when we speak of the seventh principle, it is neither quality nor quantity nor yet form that are meant, but rather the space occupied in that ocean of spirit by the results or effects impressed thereon. Now the results or effects will ultimately be the stream of our whole human existence, the whole stream of our personalities, the underlying stream of the ego, which we'll look at later. All of those will have ultimately left their effects. This is the cream which we have skimmed off out of all this whole cyclic process. None of it is permanent. And to anchor ourselves in terms of identity in any one of those would be a mistake. And just as we might say, oh yes, well, I feel myself to be the body, and here I am, this defines my existence. Looked at from this perspective, none of these is lasting. Each of these will in its turn give way. But there is a point, which is what I started saying yesterday. This is a heuristic process, and we have learnt by experience, and that has been accumulated. And although we need not concern ourselves with the future, as far as that is concerned, suffice it for us to know that none of the experience that we have accumulated is in vain. It is indelibly impressed and could not be in any way lost. Whatever we have gone through, whatever suffering we might have gone through, whatever we have understood and learnt and experienced, our pleasures and pains, our joy and suffering, all have left their mark and all are carried forward. Not in detail, but in terms of the experience that we have undergone. Now, the picture that you ultimately, it seems to me, end up with here is almost as if around a focus provided by whatever the monad might represent in the final analysis. This whole process happens. I picture this. I picture everything, of course. You have to get used to me and my pictures, I'm afraid. In this simple way. I've been longing to put a nose on this all afternoon. Probably it says, "What? No, David Chan." We picture this whole process perhaps in this way, that everything, of course, is very limited in terms of how we can represent it, but imagine that the monad represents the center. As I've suggested, this whole pictogram of a point within a circle is a perfect illustration of consciousness and form, consciousness and the field of consciousness within it. Now, imagine, if you will, this whole cyclic process as the gradual infilling of this circle. It doesn't really matter how you depict this to yourself, but perhaps we could depict it in this manner. That the first stage in the expression of the indwelling life and faculty, the 7 principles innate in the monad, is to develop a physical form, and this represents then the whole physical stream of our being. And the first stages are to develop a physical form. On the basis of that, in a pyramidal sort of fashion, another stream can then be built, and this is the intellectual stream, building toward the center. Now, she does, in the Secret Doctrine, make a point that prior to this development of this intellectual stream, she says in a place which I haven't quoted, if you incarnated the monad as the most spiritual being on earth into the most perfect form that you could imagine, it would make absolutely not the slightest bit of difference, because if there were no middle principles, no mind, this has no idea of what's going on out here. The two are so dissimilar a nature. The monad is so universal, the physical form so particular, the one so subjective, the other so objective, that there is no contact between the two. Do not imagine that this is a little man in the middle who is looking out through the eyes of. It is moving inward. One might redraw this picture. Supposing we were to turn this picture on its side and look at it in a rather more three-dimensional pattern, you might end up with, like a cone, if you will, in which we are building successive circles within the cone toward a cumulative point here, and that this represents the whole physical basis on which the forms come into existence, and this represents the intellectual stream, and this the monadic or spiritual stream up here. And these are all just pictures, and none of them are to be taken too seriously. But throughout all of this, whatever the monad represents, like a dotted line, so the projection of this dot is there throughout the whole. This is all wrong because it makes the physical look big and the monad look little. This looks specific and this looks rather general. Perhaps we ought to turn the whole thing upside down and say that really the monad represents the big circle, and that successively as we move down, this represents the physical, this represents the intellectual, and this represents the spiritual. In fact, it's an opening out rather than a closing in. That would be a better way of depicting it rather than this. I'm thinking of these images as I go. However we represent it, whatever this was, is present throughout all of this as a focus around which the process occurs. But we must not fall into the mistake of thinking of this central point as being a thing, as a focus perhaps, a point of light, a spark, animating and acting as a focus around which it happens. The analogies from the physical sciences are useful here, where we can think of this point or line as representing that around which a physical field is formed. So perhaps it might represent, by physical analogy, a wire along which an electrical current is running and around which a field is propagated, or a magnetic it represents a bar magnet, for instance, around which a magnetic field is manifested. And although the wire or the magnet in itself is doing nothing, just by radiating a field around itself, it is organizing substance in particular ways. It is acting as a field or matrix within which form comes into existence. So it's looking at it in a very much more general way than the specifics, which chapters 10 and 11 go on to describe. But it's this broad-based pattern which I'd like to get across today. So whatever the monads are, think of them as something extraordinarily general, unfocused, non-individual, to do with consciousness, to do with life, carrying with them quality, innate quality, the resultant of the evolution through the preceding kingdoms of nature. When we think of the seventh principle as it speaks, it's neither quality nor quantity in sorts of terms that we would normally think, and yet there is something there, and that is acting as a field around which this whole process is being worked out. But the individual parts of it, just as I say, the psychophysical part with which we are concerned, is different and in many respects separate from the egoic part that we refer to sometimes, which again I suspect is different and separate from the inner core, about which we are told almost nothing, the spiritual development. Spiritual very much in an unusual sense here. You get a glimpse of this, and I'm grateful for Geoffrey for having gone through this, in the after-death states. See, I believe that the information that we're given about the after-death states is very useful because it illustrates this sort of a constitution in man. So the information in Volume 2 gives us the derivation of this structure, how it came to be. The after-death states are not interesting to me in terms of what's going to happen to me when I die. I'm really not frightfully concerned with that. When I die, I'll die, and it'll happen anyway, and knowing about it in advance isn't going to make too much difference to me. But what it does do is provide illustration of the structures that we're talking about here. Now, in terms of what I've just been saying, If you review what Geoffrey was telling us earlier this afternoon, you can see some rather fascinating things begin to emerge. The whole psychophysical part of man is an entity in its own right. The body, its linga sharira, its prana, its karma manas, has made itself into an entity. You have mixed the ingredients together to make a cake, and during life you've baked that cake, and although you can identify the ingredients which went to make it, once you've made it, it's a cake for good and all, and you can't suddenly get the flour back out of the cake any longer. It's integral to the cake. It's gone through some sort of chemical transformation to make it into a cake. And although we can identify the physical substance which makes up our bodies, the energy which vitalizes it, the astral substance in our linga shariras and so forth, in terms of life, the psychophysical entity is a thing. Perhaps I would say a process, but it's an entity. This is the vehicle. The principles which underlie it we have talked about elsewhere. In this particular instance, we have built, by borrowing from everywhere else, a psychophysical being. In the after-death states, the consciousness which was welling up within that, all our states of consciousness, waking, dreaming, and all the others, now loses the whole fabric. The cake dissolves. Somebody's thrown the cake on the floor and it's now scattered into a million pieces. And therefore, whatever consciousness had been evolved, had woken up in that particular body through a process, through gestation, birth, development, and so forth, as that consciousness developed and evolved. So that is what goes. And when it says, as I've mentioned already once before today, that at the moment of death that consciousness goes, yes it does, because at that moment the brain dies, and that is what's organizing the whole cake, you might say. And without the brain, other bits of it might continue to work. Your hair continues to grow, your nails continue to grow after death. Well, it takes a little while for the mechanism to wind itself down, but you've broken the spring.
It's pretty crummy.
It's pretty crummy. Certainly is. Now, what's interesting to my mind about these after-death states is that it was Ianthe with her soup, which I think is it was a good illustration here. In the after-death states, while all the bits and pieces are still mixed up, there is no organized vehicle through which consciousness can manifest itself. It takes a while for whatever substance, psychic, mental, or whatever, to reorganize itself into a vehicle through which, or in which, consciousness can again well up. Consciousness doesn't come from anywhere. Consciousness is a resultant of particular forms. You may say that consciousness is innate in the whole, as indeed it is, but a specific consciousness requires a specific form. You might say that that's the something to be written on your wall. Specific consciousness arises out of a specific form and is dependent on it. So the consciousness of the shell that Geoffrey talked about, which is a perfect illustration of this, is a dim consciousness, because what you've left behind are only the dregs. So they've got poor material, so a poor consciousness, and an impoverished consciousness emerges within that. Whereas the Devachani
doesn't even have the astral brain. It's got nothing.
No. Whereas the Devachani, you see, has stolen the goodies, and has got all the memories and experience of the life just lived, and fashions that into a vehicle. I use this term very loosely now, the Devachanic ego, and wakes up in the dream world of its own creation, just as you wake up at night in a dream of which you have fabricated it, made it out of the experience of your day-to-day existence. So the Devachanic ego wakes up in a dream, a higher order dream, it's true, a longer lasting dream, but a dream nonetheless. The consciousness is dependent on the memories that it's taken with it and the experience that it's taken with it. And that consciousness will last just as long as that body of memory and experience is organized into a form in which consciousness can arise. And gradually, as that dies away, the consciousness within it must die away with it. Consciousness isn't something added from outside which is going anywhere. It's gone. What's left? Nothing. There's the monad, but the monad isn't a consciousness in that sense. It's not it's not that the monad now wakes up and says, David Chan's over. What now? Not like that, because it's this general field, organizing field, in which the whole process is taking place. And this field one could identify, I think, with some justice with the auric egg that Geoffrey has talked about before. What happens now in the processes prior to birth is that we now reconstruct form around this nucleus. So just as this whole process can be used to depict a long process in terms of the development through the rounds and the races to reach this point, you can again see this in miniature each life. Exactly the same steps are recapitulated in the rebirth of each man. So first to come around or within the organizing field of the monad and its auric envelope, firstly is reconstructed the physical. Now it's borrowing on, and of course, all the ingredients from somewhere else, but it's within the field, shall we say, of the monad that this happens. And so we build and rebuild and reconstruct a physical form. Within this now is reconstructed the psychological entity. And this is where the skandhas that we talked about briefly came in. We draw again into the matrix of the new entity, the elements of the old psyche, and reconstruct a personality, and then so on and upwards. And it takes a while. This is the processes of rebirth and growth, to reconstruct, to integrate together again all the disparate entities which make up, or will go to make up, the entity within the organizing field. And at death, we let go, and the bits again are dispersed for the time.
Adam,
Yeah.
after death, the septenary process continues.
Which process do you have in mind?
For instance, in Devakan will be 7 different stages.
Presumably so. The analogies given in the Mahatma letters are, as Geoffrey has said, a process of gestation. He talks about a birth into Devachan, a life, and then a death. So yes, presumably it has its 7 stages.
Yes, they do say that the Devachanic existence is on the Rupa levels, as opposed to the A-Rupa, so that the 3 and the 4 divisions still applies even to Devachan.
Yes.
And I think too, we can get a lot of understanding of what Adam's been saying by remembering that the main planes that he's been talking about, the physical, intellectual and the spiritual, are themselves all 7-fold, and that within each they have a reflection of the main plane in the subplanes, so to speak. There is a mental part even in the, what you're calling the spiritual, mental sub-level. And it's that probably could be conditioned.
Anything else which I could talk about? Yes.
When you talk about we do this and we do that, who's that we? Is that there's somebody a higher body who's taking his spectacles? Oh, let's
When did I say we?
That. What's the next step?
If I say we, expunge it from the record. Shouldn't have said it. There is no we. No, it's language. Maybe if I was speaking in Finnish, it would be different. No, it's not a silly question, because there is no we who does do all of this. And if I used we, it was only a manner of speaking. But it's important to see that it is not so. There is no.
We direct ourselves, or we are direct.
It is a process. We neither direct it, nor is it directed. It is self-direct. It directs itself. It is self-organizing. This is difficult to grasp, I think, initially, that it's neither we that do it, nor is it done to us, but it happens of itself. How does a plant grow? There is no entity within the plant which says, I will now grow, nor is there a God outside it who says, you will grow, but it just of itself grows. It is its character, it is its nature to grow. So with us. It's a very fundamental point when we see it in this light. Yes?
Does the word awake has any meaning? I think we are sleeping in different grades always.
Yes. It's a rather... did you all hear Gunnar's question? Well, I mean, normally we think of ourselves as awake here and asleep in Devachan, but the Mahatmas indicate that what we regard as waking is a state of sleeping as far as they're concerned. It's a dream indeed, yes. And who was it? We've already used this analogy, haven't we? We are the sleepwalkers, and when the Buddha is not so much the enlightened one as the awakened one, and real understanding is awakening to see what really is, what the conditions really are, which we certainly haven't done. God, I've struck them dumb. Yes, Erica.
We say we borrow from the Untitles, and at some place it says they are distinct entities, some entities. In what way can we think of them without making them anthropomorphic? As forces, as powers, as foci, or?
It is important that we try and think of them in some sort of a way. I think, to try and get some sort of idea of the influence. But mostly it's in terms of negatives, in terms of what they are not. And there was an illustration which I was thinking of using in a different context today, which I didn't, but I'll perhaps bring in now. We say that their influence is everywhere about us and in our mental function and so forth. It's neither an external influence, nor are they, as I conceive it, like us in terms of being individual consciousnesses with whom we could communicate. It's not like some ghastly science fiction story where these are some disembodied intelligences somewhere out there with whom we might communicate. Their order of being is concerned with factors in our consciousness which do not relate to space and time and the five senses. I had a little an analogy which let me try out on you, see how this one goes down. Imagine that individual personal existence is like living in a room out of which there are no doors and in which there are no windows. But projected on the walls of this room is all the experiences of normal life. So convincing is this that we don't even realize that there is a wall there at all, and we think ourselves to be free and so forth. In fact, when I was in America, I went to such a place. I don't remember what it called itself. It was a cinema which had projected in 360 degrees on the walls of the cinema. So you stood in the middle, and wherever you looked, it was always a perfect in front of you and behind you. It was very clever. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Imagine yourself to be in such a room where projected on the walls of it are all the elements of your normal physical existence. Now imagine in this rather fantastic analogy that somebody outside this room who realizes that you're inside it and wants to communicate with you, but is forbidden to use any of the five physical senses wherewith to communicate with you. So they can't knock on the walls and try and draw your attention that way. They can't flash lights through windows because there aren't any anyway. Certainly no taste or no smell is going to seep through these walls. So how are they to communicate with you? And how are they to let you know that they're there at all? Well, the only way that they can let you know that they're there is from inside you. They can't let you know from outside at all, but they can only let you know from inside. Now, all they can do is in some way influence the way in which you behave, and that there is something welling up from right inside you which would represent this influence. Now, it's of a completely different order to your normal experience. I'm not even thinking perhaps even as much as, thoughts telepathically or whatever, although you could perhaps use that and incorporate it into the analogy. But in some way, they are infusing into your consciousness whatever it is that they want to communicate. Now, imagine, if you will, the sort of order of being who is unaware of any of our normal sensory perceptions, and whose entire order of being is of what we regard of as ultimately subjective within us. The very core of our being and whence springs all things like knowledge, intuition, compassion, and so forth. Supposing that it was of this order that they infused into your consciousness, it might give you some sort of clue as to these sorts of beings. They're not going to be separate in any sense that we understand the word separate. It may be that they differ in quality. It may be that what they may infuse differs one from another, but they're not going to think of themselves as separate consciousnesses as we feel ourselves to be separate. This is the nearest I can get to conceiving or beginning to conceive of something as
Completely different dimension and yet linked.
Yes. 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 Well, you've sat here very patiently. I've had a great time up here. But it's gone 5:30, so...
I don't think anybody's going to say what scandals are. Would you like to say that before you close?
It would take too much. It would take too long.
Minus 2 minutes.
No, I can't. It would take too long. Another time, perhaps.